welcome everyone both here and online. It's great to have you join us here at Gresham College. My name's Jane Shaw and I'm the Provost, as I just said, the newish Provost at this point, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. I have a quick housekeeping announcement before I introduce the speaker, and it's to ask you to please note the emergency exits there. If you have to leave, then staff will guide you to the meeting point. This evening's lecture will be followed by a short Q&A session, as always, and you can submit your questions by scanning the QR code on the screens, which are up there, or if you're watching from home, or during the Q&A session, you can put your hand up and ask for the microphone. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Melissa Lane, our Gresham Professor of Rhetoric, and familiar to many of you at this point, as she is in her third year of office. She's also the class of 1943 Professor of Politics at Princeton University. She's specifically an authority on ancient Greek philosophy, but she's also published widely on Greek and Roman political ideas. And her most recent book is Of Rule and Office, Plato's Ideas of the Political, published in 2023. Tonight, her lecture is on a timely theme, Oligarchs and their Discontents, as part of her series this year on political crises in Athens and Rome. So thank you very much, Professor Lane.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Provost. Most charitable care have the patricians of you. So spoke the Roman senator Menenius Agrippa in Shakespeare's Coriolanus, a play about ancient Rome in about 491 BCE. Menenius was one of those patricians himself, so that meant he belonged to one of the aristocratic clans that enjoyed special privileges, such as the right to wear a certain kind of shoe. You can see the laced boot there on the bottom right, and also exclusive access to certain offices. So the you to whom he's speaking at this moment in the play is a group of plebeians. And these were the relatively poor Roman citizens who had become self-conscious political actors just a few years before in a momentous event in 494, when a large number of the poor, as the historian T.J. Cornell writes, who were oppressed by debt and arbitrary treatment, withdrew from the city en masse. And this was known as the first ever secession of the plebs. The plebs seceded, they withdrew and withheld their labor until the patricians were forced to accept concessions. So they had to accept a plebeian assembly and the creation of tribunes, officials who were elected by the plebeians to protect them physically and legally from endangerment. So we can see this as a settlement between the oligarchs and the rest. So here's my title term. It comes from ancient Greek, meaning the rule, arche, of the few. Oligo means the few, and in practice, that means the relatively few and relatively wealthy who use their economic and social power as a basis to claim political authority. Now, in practice, then, Shakespeare's play explores the dynamics of oligarchic power in Rome. So Menenius, for example, who was attempting to reassure the plebeians, as I began by quoting, elicited only scorn from an anonymous second citizen in the play who retorts, "Care for us? They never cared for us yet. They suffer us to famish and their storehouses crammed with grain." And he complained that they were trying, the patricians, the oligarchs, were trying to repeal the acts that had been established against the rich just those few years before, the new assembly, the new tribunes, those are the wholesome acts. And instead, they were providing more piercing statutes daily to chain up and restrain the poor. Now, second citizens' mistrust was warranted. Many of the patricians of the time did hold views, these views of the kind that he feared, and that Livy would describe as saying that the patricians openly preferred license for themselves rather than liberty for everyone. Yet Shakespeare's play showcases a divide among the patricians, the oligarchs, that will be central to this lecture. So on the one hand, we have what I call the accommodationist model. And this is exemplified by Menenius in that speech. So Menenius was willing to tolerate popular power up to a point. He was willing to accept the new assembly and the tribunes. But he tried to persuade the masses of the special role that the patricians should continue to enjoy in the body politic. And he did that in a famous speech, literally, about the body politic. So he compares the plebeians to mutinous limbs. Their arms and legs are in mutiny against the belly. The belly enjoys all the good food and is, in the eyes of the limbs, idle and inactive. But the belly replies that it is the storehouse and the shop of the whole body. So Menenius is trying to justify the special privileges of the patrician senate that have a belly full of wealth, but he claims are using it to benefit the common people. It should be said that he somewhat undermined the force of the metaphor by comparing second citizen to the body's big toe. Second citizen is not impressed with that comparison. But Shakespeare's play also dramatizes a different stance that I'll call the irredentist model of reactionary resistance by oligarchs who try to turn the clock back on popular power. So this model is exemplified by the figure of Coriolanus himself, who refuses to flatter and pacify the plebeians. Indeed, once he's elected consul, he threatens them with a grain shortage, threatening them with famine, just as second citizen had feared, if they don't agree to abolish the tribunes. The threat fails, the tribunes remain, and Coriolanus vows eternal hatred to Rome, turning traitorously to join its enemies in attacking the city. So we can see both irredentist and accommodationist moments in Roman history going forward. For example, a few decades later, after Coriolanus's treason, this group, known as the Second Decemvirate, who were originally appointed as law reformers, would aggrandize their powers to the point of doing away with elections and so with the means of securing equal liberty. And that oligarchic venture was only overturned by a second secession of the plebs. Though still in the aftermath, a tribune would warn them to be wary, saying, "Don't you realize in what an atmosphere of contempt you live? The patricians would deprive you of part of the daylight if they could." So what we see in Roman history is a kind of alternation between accommodation and irredentism. So on the right, you see the two episodes I already mentioned, these reactionary overturning efforts. And on the left, you see what we already saw, the accommodation with the tribunes in 494, and another moment when the tribunes forced the consulship to be open to plebeian candidates. But the point I want to emphasize is that in Rome, accommodationism only ever went so far. The upper classes always kept the upper hand. And that was because of what you see on the bottom left, the elitist structure of the Roman constitution. So throughout the life of the Roman Republic, the Senate always enjoyed special political rights and privileges. And the richest classes, for example, were allowed to vote first in some of the assemblies. So they could, in principle, win a majority before the poorest ever even got to cast their votes. So we can say that the Roman accommodationist model was top-down. The elites periodically had to accommodate popular demands, but only up to a certain point. They always remained dominant in the Republic. Now, by contrast, then, in Athens, we see an accommodationist model that was bottom-up. Once democratic power had been firmly established, the aristocratic and wealthy found themselves under the popular thumb. And this was recognized by some of the elites even at the time. So someone who's left a text that we refer to as written by an old oligarch, I've talked about this once before, 2 years ago in my lecture on democracy, left us a text where he says, the people, meaning the common people, know that it is more beneficial for them not to hold the highest offices, but to let the most capable men hold them. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't sound very bottom-up. If the most capable men, the elites, are elected to the high offices, isn't that top-down? Well, the problem was that being elected to high office in Athens brought great risks. As one historian has written, any Athenian general, for example, who demonstrated incompetence or suffered a major defeat was likely to be brought to trial. They could try to use their powers of eloquence, but they might well hesitate to return to the city. And indeed, he continues to explain that many of the generals who were indicted went into voluntary exile to avoid a jury trial because they risked being held responsible for anything that didn't live up to the expectations of the people. And so the jury trial gave popular juries composed of citizens selected originally by lot, who chose to turn up to the jury courts on a given day, the power to hold the elite leaders to accountability, even including exile, fines, and even, in some cases, the sentence of death. So this bottom-up Athenian accommodation required the oligarchs to bite their tongues and swallow their pride more dramatically than did the top-down Roman model. And so Athenian irredentism would lead to even more radical moves by the oligarchs than we saw in Rome. So let's compare the Athenian and Roman models. So Coriolanus, for all his bitterness, was trying only to reverse some plebeian gains. He wasn't trying to overturn the whole political constitution. And as we saw, Menenius and his like, in contrast, were willing to accept some plebeian gains, but still remain, in many ways, on top. But in Athens, just as bottom-up accommodation went to the opposite extreme, where the popular juries were able to keep the elites under their thumb, so that drove some of the oligarchs in Athens to the more irredentist extreme. So they weren't just seeking to quell certain popular gains, they would seek to overturn the democracy itself, to monopolize political power, even to the point of stripping their opponents of citizenship. And this is what I want to focus on for the remainder of the lecture. The historian Matthew Simonton has argued that oligarchy as a movement in classical Greece really took shape as a reaction to democracy. So as he describes it, it was a bundle of defensive and reactionary techniques. And so Athenian irredentism is reactionary revolution. These oligarchs are not willing to accept any kind of popular game. They want to reverse the democratic constitution to overturn democratic citizenship. And in fact, in the late 5th century, they tried to do that twice. And so I now want to look at how subversive elites can attempt to overthrow the democracy, regroup, and try again, becoming even more brutal the second time, a phenomenon that we sometimes also see today. And in the conclusion, I'll discuss how the democracy ultimately restored itself and managed to live with the oligarchs going forward. So the moral of the story is that democracies have always had oligarchs within them and have always had to figure out how to handle them. So now 2 oligarchic revolts and then the restoration of democracy. So we see in the 5th century a struggle between the oligarchs and democracies across the ancient Greek world, and this intensified during the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, when the Spartans supported oligarchs and the Athenians supported democrats. And these oligarchic revolts, trying to turn the clock back, could have an immense human cost. So for example, Thucydides describes the civil war in this period in the Greek polis of Corcyra, its modern Corfu. You might recognize it there on the map, when oligarchs were accused of seeking to dissolve the democracy. And Thucydides said that as a result, in the ensuing civil war, one saw every imaginable kind of death. Fathers killed their sons, people were dragged from the temples and slaughtered in front of them. Now in Athens, push came to oligarchic shove, to this reactionary oligarchic shove of irredentist revolts, in the aftermath of military defeats. So first of all, in 415, a major military expedition by the Athenians is destroyed. And in the aftermath, we have a first oligarchic takeover in 411. And then Athens definitively loses the war in 404, and the oligarchs try again in its wake. So let's look at both of those efforts. So 411 BCE, when the oligarchic party becomes known as the 400. And to give you a sense of who these men were, so one of them was Antiphon. He was famous for his rhetorical skills as a kind of lawyer on call, writing speeches for others. Another was a man named Theramenes, who went generally with the prevailing winds. Antiphon would ultimately be tried and executed for his role in the 400, and we'll see later what happens to Theramenes. So, 404, these 2 men and their comrades start by getting control of the council and assembly and monopolizing the speeches there to the point that if anyone did speak out against them, he quickly and conveniently turned up dead. These were crimes for which no suspects were brought to justice. With dissent made impossible, people imagined that the number of conspirators was far greater than it really was. And this paved the way for an irregular assembly meeting that was held outside Athens when 10 of the conspirators had been set up as law reformers. And the first proposal they make outside Athens at this other assembly is that they abolished prosecution for proposing changes that would be illegal under the prior laws. So if you think about that, if no one can be prosecuted for proposing illegal changes to the laws, that nullifies the democratic rule of law that had previously obtained. So they nullify the democratic laws and they nullify the democratic offices. They announce that no one would hold office or receive pay under the old constitution, and that amounts to ousting the existing state officials, abolishing the wages for office, and they also restrict male citizenship to just 5,000 men by instituting a wealth threshold. Why 5,000? Well, the idea is that these are those who are best able to serve with their persons and their wealth, and they want to give them full power to make treaties with whoever they wished. So what does this mean, serve with their persons and their wealth? This is turning the principle of democratic public service upside down. The Democrats claimed power based especially on rowing in the fleet, which they could do without any private means. But the wealthier purchased their own sword and spear to serve in the hoplite land army. And the 5,000 is just about equivalent to those who could afford to make that purchase. So that's what it means that they can serve the state by their persons and their wealth. Now, all of that said, despite naming the 5,000, the 400 really want to concentrate power in their own hands. And they do that by establishing a new official body, a council of 400. So this is why we call them the council. And the important point for me here is that this is an official body. So the 400 exercise their power through holding office in this council, and it monopolizes a lot of the powers that the democracy had widely distributed. So this new council has the sole authority to legislate, to appoint magistrates, to formulate oaths, and to hold other office holders to account. Now, with those powers, then, they began to act with what Thucydides calls an iron hand. They're using violence to maintain their power. Now, there is a wrinkle here, because I've been calling them oligarchs, and one of our other ancient sources calls this an oligarchy, straight out. But they're also trying to claim the mantle of the preceding democracy. So as I spoke about in my lecture in October, Cleisthenes was remembered as the founder of the Athenian democracy, but the 400 want to lay claim to the traditional laws that he had enacted when he set up the democracy. So they're rewriting history, trying to claim that Cleisthenes really had intended a kind of oligarchy all along. So how did this regime eventually fall? Well, the Democrats had naval forces on the island of Samos who took an oath to practice democratic government themselves and to regard the 400 as their enemies. And in this remarkable observation, Thucydides says that they told themselves that they must not become demoralized thinking that their city had abandoned them, since it was the few who had revolted from them, the many. In other words, the Democrats were the real body of the city all along. And while these democratic forces regrouped abroad, the oligarchs at home had their own Achilles heel. They fell into the fierce internal rivalry that tends to be the downfall of such oligarchies. And so the city held a new assembly to depose the 400. They turned the government really over to the 5,000, and that was a stepping stone to the restoration of the full democracy. The fate of the 400, as we saw, Antiphon was among those executed. Some others went on trial and escaped, we think, into voluntary exile. And some of the rest betrayed one another, trying to claim that they had been the good oligarchs and that some of their fellows were the ones who should really be punished. Our friend Theramenes is among them. He lived to fight another day. So that brings us then to the next moment, which is after, in 404, the fall of Athens to Sparta, the military defeat, and now the second oligarchic takeover, which is known by the name of the 30. We have two narratives. The more famous is the one given by the historian Xenophon, who actually lived through these events as a young man. So what I'm going to emphasize is how the 30 was even more radical, even more irredentist than the 400, and then we'll see how democracy was ultimately restored. So, in 404, the Spartans have conquered Athens. They're physically in Athens. That's the Spartan general Lysander. And in that context, the oligarchs try again, many of them the very same who had tried 7 years before, if they'd managed to escape punishment for that. So once again, they propose a new body of men to act as law reformers, and the Athenians appoint 30 men to draw up the ancestral laws. But the 30 don't really do that job. Xenophon says they were charged with writing up the laws, but they continually postponed writing the laws down and publishing them for all to see. So instead, what the 30 did was to consolidate power in their own hands. And what I want to emphasize is that they consolidate power, not office. So remember, I stressed that the 400 had held office. They had set up this new council on which they served. The 30, as far as we know, actually held themselves above the constraints of political office. The only official position that we know that they held, and it wasn't really an official position, was that of the law reformers. But law reformers had no fixed term of office, and they were not subject to any kind of accountability measures. So the 30, as far as we know, don't even serve on the council that exists in their period. They're really acting as these extraordinary puppet masters who are above and outside all the ordinary constraints of political office. And they use, this is the 30, these are the names of the 30, so we know all their names. Critias, who was their leader, had been a friend and associate of Socrates, but we have no record of any of them actually holding an office during the time that the 30 were effectively in power. And so what did they do? They pulled the strings with excessive violence. So their violence was even more extreme than that of the 400. They had attendants armed with whips. They used violence to destroy the democracy, initially against sycophants who were unpopular, but then to put to death their opponents who could have opposed them on the basis of wealth, birth, or reputation, and also because they wanted to plunder the property of many in the city. And so the 30 are really using their power to enrich themselves. As oligarchs, they seek nakedly to use political power to convert it into even more economic power. Now, that policy ultimately drove Theramenes into opposition. He spoke out against this policy of private peculation and greed. And that led him, in turn, to be literally declared an enemy of the people. Critias spoke against him at a council meeting. He announced, "I erase this man from the list," and the 30 are empowered to execute those not on the list of citizens. And indeed, Theramenes would be dragged off and executed. How did the 30 fall? Well, that's a story that I want to tell. In terms of violence, and then the restoration of democracy through amnesty and accountability. So this is my final section. So we have to say first that it took violence to fight violence. The 30 were defeated in a desperate battle with democratic forces. Again, those who'd been driven into exile, deprived of their citizenship, regrouped and then attacked and killed many of the 30, including Critias, in the fighting. And then they reestablished the democratic constitution. Now, you can imagine that the victorious Democrats were tempted just to put any of the surviving oligarchs to the sword. And in fact, it seems that in the aftermath of the previous oligarchic coup, the Athenians had vowed to kill anyone who would overthrow the democracy. But that's not actually what they choose to do in 403 after they've ousted the 30. Instead, they choose a policy of amnesty, and this has 3 dimensions. So first of all, they allow those oligarchs who choose to simply leave Athens and withdraw to their own enclave. Those who chose to remain would have peace established, a settling of property disputes, a sharing of religious sites, and a commitment to amnestia. That's the Greek word that gives us our word amnesty, and it's described as not remembering past wrongs. What that seems to have meant was not prosecuting people beyond the disputes that had been settled, so not trying again to stir up complaints that had been settled through this process. And then thirdly, for the 30 themselves and their key henchmen, the amnesty would require that they submit accounts for their period in power, and no approval would be given to anyone who had committed homicide with their own hands. So amnesty was not remembering, but that did not mean complete forgetting. People remembered what the 30 had done, but they didn't use those memories as weapons to continue trying to undo the peace that had been established. Still, they would remember it, and for example, the trial of Socrates in 399 would decades later be described as having convicted him because he was shown to have been the teacher of Critias. That's how an orator described the trial of Socrates some decades later. Now, what I want to close on then is what that final demand in the amnesty settlement actually meant. And that was, again, the requirement that members of the 30 had to give accounts for their period in power. Now, when we look back at the aftermath of the 400, we can see a kind of distancing from the legitimacy of those who had held office under the 400. So when the new democratic treasurers came into power after the 400 had been ousted, they used a new stone slab to inscribe their accounts, as if, as one historian has said, to emphasize their distance from the boards of the previous year. So it was a kind of subtle distancing. But the problem of how to hold the 30 accountable was more challenging because, as I argued, they had held power without holding office. So the question then is how to read the amnesty demand that they submit accounts. Now, many historians have read this as if it was just business as usual, as if this was just a matter of procedural routine. Accounts had always been required under the preceding democracy, so the 30 had to submit their accounts in order to have their citizen rights confirmed. But I think that's a mistake, because I think the crucial thing about these irredentist oligarchs, the 30, is that they had precisely rejected any principle of accountability for themselves. That's why they exercised power outside the constraints of office. And so instead, rendering accounts, that requirement of these oligarchs, was a way of reinstituting a democratic norm. It was a way of insisting that all power must now be rendered legally accountable precisely because it had not been exercised that way during the oligarchic coup. Now, this Athenian model of amnesty and accountability offers a new way to think about the dilemmas facing post-populist regimes today. So consider Poland in 2023, when parliamentary elections overturned a populist regime. And these are reflections of a Polish judge afterwards thinking about the dilemma that was faced then, and how the restored democracy should treat the office holders of the populist period. And he described the reformers as being caught between these two alternatives. Should they continue to adhere rigorously and meticulously to legal provisions as long as they still formally apply, or was that in a way to miss the point? Could that sort of adherence to the minutiae of legal provisions only serve to entrench the pathological system by pretending, in effect, that nothing had happened in between? So as I see it, the Athenian democracy in 403 had found a third way to tame the oligarchs. They acknowledged that legal norms of the democracy had been overturned, but they reinstituted them in order to restore the rule of law. So, in other words, radical irredentism, this adventurism of oligarchs to try to impose a reactionary revolution, was tamed only by enforcing radical accommodation once again, the bottom-up accommodation on which Athenian democracy had previously hinged. And so we must reflect on how to tame oligarchs. That problem in democratic politics has always been with us. And the challenge is to overcome the bitterness that can lead to civil war, lest we suffer again the fate of Corcyra, whereas Thucydides described ideological strife produced distrust everywhere, and nothing, no binding word or awe-inspiring oath, could end it. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we have plenty of time for questions. So you can send them either via the QR code on the screen or put your hand up now. In which case, I will ask you some of my questions. My first one is really about your sources. You occasionally put things like Xenophon up there,
yes,
but you presented a very beautiful, clean account of this. But you're probably piecing it together.
Yes.
And I'm sure those people have perspectives. Can you tell us a
Absolutely.
bit more about what's behind the scenes in your research to come to this account?
Very much a question from a professional historian, as our provost is. Yes, this is a wonderful question. So for both of these moments in Athenian history, both of the revolts, we have two narrative sources for each from the Greek classical ancient period. So we have, as I said, for the 400, we have Thucydides, who had lived through that period, and then for the 30, we have Xenophon, who also lived through the period. And then for both of those oligarchic revolts, we have a text from probably about 80 years later, which is known as the Constitution of the Athenians. It was composed in Aristotle's Lyceum, and we don't know if it was written by Aristotle. I like to think it was written by one of his graduate students. So one does have, for each of these moments, one does have to sort of triangulate, but in both cases, between the two sources. I privilege privileged the Thucydides and Xenophon narratives because these are contemporary. They're written really by people living at the time. But of course, both of them have their perspectives. Thucydides makes his view of the 400 very clear. He says, actually, that regime that was established just after the 400, so when the 5,000 were given real power, Thucydides says that was a mixture of oligarchy and democracy, and that was the best constitution in Athens in my lifetime. So he puts his cards on the table, not quite for the 400, but for the 5,000. And Xenophon probably also, he was too young to serve in the 30, but he ends up spending much of his life in Sparta and kind of admiring the Spartan version of oligarchy. So we do have to see both of those narratives as very much told from a somewhat sympathetic to oligarchy perspective. Yeah.
Other questions in the room? Oh, I've got one here. It's fascinating that the arguably most forceful oligarchs are those with the lowest numbers. Do you believe elites are more powerful when they contain fewer people, when there are fewer of them?
That's such an interesting question. I was just looking at an article about Athenian history that titles it "The Numbers Game," and is really arguing, why all the, to try to make sense of the numbers. And I think that your suggestion is very compelling. The idea is that if there are fewer, then there might be fewer opportunities for fissures and sort of partisanship among the elite. Nevertheless, even the 30, as we saw with Theramenes kind of defecting, still suffer a kind of internal rivalry. But it does seem to have allowed them to act in this, as Xenophon describes, tyrannical manner. One thing I suppressed from this lecture is that the 30 might be better known to you as the 30 tyrants, and they're often called that. I've actually done research where I would argue that that label only comes much later, that in the time and in the immediate aftermath, they're thought of as an oligarchy and not as tyrants, but the fact that they were a small group allowed them to act in a way as if they were a tyrant. 30 men sort of all acting as long as they could maintain their unity, kind of in a way comparable to tyrannical action.
Other questions in the room, maybe? Yes. Wait, if you don't mind waiting for the microphone, that'd be great.
Okay.
Hello. I think just to check my understanding a bit of what makes up an oligarch.
Yeah.
And understanding social status and wealth being qualifying criteria, I think, from what you've said. And perhaps also something I heard about eloquence, being able to speak eloquently about your... Was there anything else in terms of what they represented in either things that brought them together or separated them in their thinking, ideology, any other characteristics about them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So exactly as you said, I think the key issues are having a certain kind of social standing that was primarily based on possession of wealth. There was some divergence, some people had a kind of older aristocratic lineage, but might have lost some of their wealth. Then you have sort of nouveau riche who are trying to make their way into the sort of groups of oligarchs. So you see that in both Athens and Rome, that group sort of expands and becomes more explicitly based on wealth and not just based on inheritance. But it's that idea that you have a kind of elite status, and in Athens in particular, this was a time when there was very little public education. And so it meant that the elites were able to buy a kind of education for their children that poorer people couldn't afford. And so that's the link to what you heard me say exactly right about many of the elites then had special rhetorical skills. And so they had special training that allowed them then to mobilize kind of political power. But as I tried to show, there's still a range of opinion among them. So some of them, like Menenius and the Old Oligarch in Athens, are willing to say, okay, we're willing to abide by the rules of the republic or the democracy. We still want to have some special privileges, but we're willing to kind of basically accept the rules of the game. And then you have those who decide, no, we want to overturn the rules of the game. We want explicitly to drive many of the poorer citizens out of formal citizenship status. So I think that's really the line. The irredentist move is to say that many of the poor just shouldn't even be citizens anymore. We should drive them out, and the city should be run only for the benefit of the elites. And it's really that line that's in question. So thank you.
I think there's a question on the front row here, if you don't mind waiting for the microphone.
Thank you. I was wondering about the role of public trials. You touched on it a little bit. What do you think about their role? And you mentioned, obviously, that collective sense of justice. How much did that play into the restoration of democracy, and sort of what needs to happen in relation to public trials?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's two dimensions to that question. So one is the role of the public trials sort of under democracy as normal, and then the other is the role of the public trials in the restoration. So the first point was to say the role of the juries in Athenian democracy was one of the main ways that the bottom-up accommodation was enforced, because if elites did things that went against what the common people expected or wanted, if they failed in their role as leaders, as we saw in that quotation about the generals, then the public trial could fine them, exile them, sentence them to death. And so that power in the law courts was really central to what it meant for the common people to be in power, which is what democracy really means. In the restoration of the democracy, then, there was also the role for the public trials. So again, I think it was very interesting how graphic this was in the amnesty settlement. Anyone who was found or accused of having committed homicide with their own hands, right, would be sent to a homicide trial. And those trials had a slightly different organization and took place in a slightly different way. But I think it's very interesting that they sort of saw this difference. It was one thing to order people to death. It's another thing to have killed with your own hands. The sort of blood guilt and religious impiety that committing homicide with your own hands involved meant that those people were just beyond the pale of the amnesty. They couldn't be granted that at all. So the trials, the public trials, and then also the public judgment of the accountability procedures, which was done by other panels, not exactly juries, but similar to juries. Those were crucial mechanisms for kind of reasserting this popular control.
Great. Gentleman in red top, just there.
Do we know how the 30 and the 400 took decisions? Because it would seem to me, particularly in the case of the larger number, it would be something akin to herding cats.
Yes, well, so good. So I think that's where it's important, and it goes back to the earlier question. Obviously, if you have 30, you can get them all in a room. 400, you can get them in a room, but it's going to be herding cats, as you say, unless you have a kind of formal political institution, a kind of Robert's Rules of Orders institution. And I think that's why I emphasized that it was important that they set up this new council, and they were the 400 as the members of the council. And so therefore they had a kind of Robert's Rules, as it were, parliamentary procedure. They had formal mechanisms for, proposing motions, for voting, and so on. The 30, I think, could operate somewhat among themselves in this more informal way. Now, the 30 also, there was a council during the 30, so they interact with the council, but as the 30, they aren't any formal body. They seem to have sort of operated in this more conspiratorial, behind-the-scenes way. But yes, so the formal council of 400, but unlike the previous Democratic Council of 500, under the democracy, the council had 500, so the oligarchs say, no, we're going to have our own new council, 400. And then, as I said, that new council collected a lot of powers that in the democracy had been more widely dispersed. So powers that had been with the assembly, powers that had been with some other office holders, all that was now arrogated to the council, which the 400 then kind of organized and managed themselves through that institution.
Yes, gentleman there.
I love the comparison when you extrapolate it to the current times.
Yeah.
Do you think, as an hypothesis, the institutionalization of the rule of law can have that countervailing impact in terms of institutionalizing and reinforcing the power of the oligarchs? Because that can be tremendously relevant for the future geopolitics. And,
well, this is why the Poland case is so interesting. It's not my own area of expertise, but I have learned from colleagues who've worked very closely, on this process in Poland. And my understanding is that I think many of the people in the legal system there have found themselves really between a rock and a hard place, as in the quotation that I ended on, because, in a sense, under the populist regime, for example, many judges were appointed. So now, with the restoration of a more democratic regime, is upholding the rule of law keeping those judges? Or is it ousting those judges? And that's the sort of paradox, that it's not clear which is the more democratic move or which move sort of promises better to really restore the rule of law, because some of those judges might not be committed to the democratic constitution as it's now being enforced, and yet if you oust them, that might seem like itself an undemocratic move. So I think that there are real sort of paradoxes in attempting to come to grips with these kinds of political challenges.
Question in the front row here.
I've got one here. Thank you. I just wanted to ask more about what was involved in these writing down of accounts, what was in the accounts, and also whether there was a psychological element to that, insofar as if somebody has been really operating in a kind of unaccountable sort of vacuum. By actually making them write something down, it makes it part of history, and it makes them face also psychologically what they've done. And even if they might not have committed murder with their own hands, they are then psychologically having to admit to themselves and everybody else what they've done, which might be less palatable to other people. I think that's a really, really clever way of kind of circumnavigating that whole issue about how do you set aside a previous period that has sort of been overcome and yet create something new without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's really interesting.
Thank you so much. I think your insight into the process of accounts and indeed the relationship between accounts and accountability, I think, is something that we sometimes forget. So in the Athenian democracy, these accounts actually had two stages. So the first stage for someone who had been a real office holder, so in the normal kind of operation, was a financial accounts. You had to literally, if you'd been in charge of any public monies, you had to give a financial accounting. But Athens then had a second stage where anyone could come and lodge a complaint against how an official had exercised their power. And then you had to give much more of a narrative kind of psychological account, exactly as you perceived. And I think in the case of the 30, that's really what was going to be involved. The issue, the public monies was one thing, but the more significant thing was owning up to what they had done with the powers that they had had. And I think that you're exactly right. We're familiar now with processes as in South Africa, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where having people tell what they had done and therefore articulating it, having it voiced, having it recorded was a crucial part of restoring a kind of meaningful popular, or establishing a meaningful popular rule there. I don't think there's some differences with what happened in Athens, but the sort of broader principle, I think, as you've perceived, is common. And I find this relationship between accounts and accountability very profound, that it really starts just in financial accounts, but it has grown into this much richer legal and political and ethical concept.
So we have a question that's come through on the QR code. Today we have instances where democratically elected people behave like oligarchs and rule to benefit themselves. This could be a yes/no question. Were there such cases in the ancient world?
Yes, exactly.
You can elaborate beyond yes.
Yes. So this is exactly, in a way, what I wanted to show is that there have always been oligarchs within democracy. I mean, certainly now when we think about ancient Athens, we see that there were these people who were distinguished by their disproportionate wealth and their disproportionate social power, social esteem. And then the question is really, how did they act? Now, what I was describing with both of those moments of irredentism was there's a sense in which you could say they were elected, right? Some group was established as law reformers, so there was a kind of democratic process, but in both cases, it was under Spartan pressure. So you could say, well, it wasn't a sort of wholly legitimate democratic process. And then they morphed those powers into powers that went far beyond those that they'd been formally accorded. But even if we look at the operation within the democracy, I think you can still see people who were elected as generals who, accumulated very significant amounts of power in the city. And in fact, here's maybe a good moment. What I'm going to talk about next week is the death of Athenian democracy. When did Athenian democracy die? And what we'll see is that there's a real divide among historians. For example, about one figure, about a century after the affairs that I've been discussing tonight, whom some historians describe as an oligarch, and another historian has compared to Pericles. So this question of, is this figure an oligarch? Is he like the great democratic leader Pericles? How could he be described in both ways? I think that will be a very interesting question that I'm going to tackle directly in my lecture next week.
So that's the perfect note on which to close. I'm going to thank you all for your brilliant questions. As always, we have such great audiences here. And thank Melissa for her fabulous lecture. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.